In this video, we'll be working through using Excel to be able to construct a frequency distribution for a data set. So over here on the left column, you'll see that there is a data set of triglyceride levels that we are going to organize into a frequency distribution. So first of all, there's a few things that we're going to need to find first before we can start constructing our frequency distribution. So to help us be able to figure out our class width eventually here, we're going to need to know what the minimum and the maximum values are in our data set. So there's a couple ways we can figure that out pretty quickly. So there is a function in Excel that allows us to be able to figure out the minimum of a data set. So whenever we're entering things into Excel and we're doing math and entering functions, you always want to make sure you double click into a cell and get the blinking cursor, and then we need to type in the equals sign always. So in order to find a minimum of a data set, if I just start typing the word minimum, you'll see that MIN there, and if you read right there, it says returns the smallest number in a set of values, so it will tell us what the minimum is. So I'm going to put a parentheses now, and then what I need to do is I'm going to move my cursor over here and I'm going to select all of the data values in my data set right here. And so if I scroll back up here, it'll show A3 colon A28, and what that means is it's taking from cell A3, so column A, row 3, starting with that number, going all the way down to the 28th row, which is the last number in data set. So it's finding the minimum value among that set of numbers, and then I can close off parentheses. All right, there we go. And what it finds then is that the minimum value in this data set is 138. So right there, it'd be the smallest number in the data set. Similarly, if we need to find a maximum, first of all, type in equal, start typing the word maximum, and max is the function for maximum, and then parentheses, and we'll do the same thing. We'll click that first cell and hold, and then drag down and release once we get to that last value, selecting A3 through A28, and the maximum in our data set would be 462. Now, an alternative way that you could also figure out the minimum and maximum is you could take this data set, and if you just go ahead and select the numbers, then if I move up here, see where it says sort and filter, you can sort the numbers. So I could sort them from smallest to largest, and that gives you a pretty quick look to see that then 138 is now the first number, and the numbers are ordered, and you'll see down here at the bottom the largest number is then 462. To determine the number of data values, if I type in equals and then the word count, we can count the number of data values that would be in the data set. And if I just select the data set, there we go, it's going to count how many numbers there are in that data set, and it counts that there are 26 numbers. Now also, if you just go straight ahead and you select those data values, if you look down here towards the bottom, you'll see it says count 26, which means that I've selected 26 different cells there, so there are 26 numbers. Now the number of classes can vary depending on how many different groups of data that you want to have in your frequency distribution. So for this particular example, I'm going to use 5, so we're going to divide our data set into 5 equal classes. So with this information now, we can determine what our class width will be, or how many data values there will be in each particular class. So to be able to determine that, we'll type in equals. So we want to look at the range of our data set and figure out what that range would be. So that's going to be taking our maximum, which is 462, minus the minimum of 138 first. And then we need to take that range and divide it into the number of classes, which is 5. Now, alternatively, we could just, instead of typing in 462, you can see that 462 actually comes from column D, row 4, so you could type in D4, and so you can see that it's going to pull in 462, and then 138 comes from cell D3, pull from that red cell. So we're taking 462 minus 138, and then we're dividing that by 5. We can hit enter, and this will calculate then our class width to be 64.8. Now, no matter what we get for this value right here, we always want to round it up to the next whole integer. So this is going to be bumped up to 65. So really, our actual class width should be 65, rounding that 64.8 up. So once this is established, we can go ahead and start forming our classes for the data set. So for our class lower limit, for the first one, it's going to be our smallest value in our data set, or a minimum, which is 138. And then using our class width of 65, we can determine all these other class lower limits. So to calculate our next one, we're going to take 138 and add 65 to it, which gives us our next lower limit of 203, and then similarly equals, and then 203, and add 65 to that, etc. Now, there's a quicker way to be able to do this. Rather than having to type into each individual cell, we can create a formula to be able to generate these lower limits. So what's happening every time here is we're always going to continue adding 65 to the cell previous. So instead of 138, or for example, in the next one, instead of 203, we could just type in where 138 comes from. So 138 comes from cell F and row cell F3. So if we take F3 and add 65 to it, that's going to generate 203. Now the nice thing about this is once we generate this, so you see how the cursor I have right now looks like a white plus sign. If I drag it to the right corner of the cell, it changes to kind of a black cross. So what we can do is we can click and hold and drag this down. So this would be now at the third class, the fourth class, and the fifth class. We got 5 classes. And it drags down and it copies down this formula. So to generate this value, we took F3, the number before, and added 65. And then because we drag this formula down, it's changing F3 to F4. And so now we're taking 203 plus 65, etc. For our class upper limit, since our first class starts at 138 and the next one starts at 203, this first class should be stopping at the value just before 203, which would be 202. So we can choose that as our starting value for this class upper limit. And then similarly, we want to be taking that 202 and adding the class width of 65 to it. But the 65 is always going to stay the same, so we want to leave that. But this value is going to change depending on where we're at. So instead of 202, we're going to type where 202 comes from. And 202 comes from cell G4. And then I'll hit enter. Oh, I'm sorry. It comes from G3, actually. There we go. So G3. And then we should get the next value. So 202 plus 65 gives you 267. So then you can click just once into that cell, and then once you do that, move to the bottom right corner of that cell so that this white plus sign changes to a black cross, just like there. And we can click and drag down and generate the rest of these class upper limits. So now at this point, we want to determine the frequency of our data values and how many data values occur within each particular class. So the most simple way probably is because I have my data set ordered over here, I could just simply look and see how many data values I have between 138 and 202. So going from 138 through 202, okay, I can include 209, so just through 200. So I've highlighted those values that are between 138 and 200, and if I go down towards the bottom here, it tells me my count is 12. What that's telling me is then there are 12 data values that are between there, so that would be my frequency for that particular class. And then we can repeat the same process. So we look at the range of 203 through 267, and so we start at 209, and it looks like 265 is the last one that would fit in that range. Select those cells, and we count that there are 6. And we can continue, we can find all those frequencies. Now there is a formulaic way that we can determine the frequencies also. So one way we can do that is first of all selecting all of these 5 cells where we're going to figure out what the frequencies are, and then I'm moving up to this fx where we're going to be able to insert a function. And what we want to be able to search for is we want to be able to search for a frequency function. So I can search for frequency, and so here's the function that we want, the frequency function. So there's 2 things that we need to fill in here. One's called the data array, and one is called the bins array. So to first of all select the data array, I'm going to click this button right over here, and it's going to collapse that. And so what I need to do here is I need to select the data that we want to be using. So I'm going to select these numbers from my data set, just like that. So it's selecting, as you can see here, cells A3 through A28, and I'll hit enter. And so now we have selected our data array. Now our bins array is going to establish what the limits are for counting our data in particular classes. And so our bins are actually going to be selected from our class upper limits. So I'm going to select this button right here, and it'll collapse that. Now I'm going to select these class upper limits right here, and what I'm going to do is I'm only actually going to select all of them except for the last one. Because what's going to happen here is we're going to determine our frequency for the first class as being all the numbers that are less than 202. Okay, and then the formula will know then that we'll be able to count how many data values are then less than 267 but greater than 202, and then 332 and 397, and then it will know because we've selected this cell down here that we're going to count how many data values there are greater than 397. So we don't need to pick that last class upper limit. We can hit enter, and then we've selected G3 through G6. Now, instead of hitting OK here, you're going to want to hit 3 buttons on your keyboard. So you're going to want to hit Control, Shift, and then Enter. All 3 buttons at the same time. So again, Control, Shift, and Enter. And then it will tell you your frequency. So there are 12 numbers in the first class, 6, 4, 1, and finally 3. Next are the class midpoints, and our midpoints need to be the values that are right between the class lower limit and the class upper limit in each particular class. So the way we would determine this first class midpoint is we'd want to average 138 and 202 by taking that 138 and adding it to 202 and then dividing it by 2. But this is not how we're going to calculate all of the class midpoints. So since the 138 will fluctuate based on what our class lower limit will be, we're going to type in cell F3 because that's where 138 comes from. And then for 202, we'll type in cell G3 because that's where 202 comes from. So I do have these in parentheses, so we find the sum first, and then we divide it by 2, and then we can hit enter, and it calculates the class midpoint being 170. Then we can copy this formula down to the rest of the cells below by first selecting the cell and taking that white plus sign, moving it to the bottom right corner, making it a black cross. Click, hold, and drag this down, and it copies that formula down. So you'll see, for example, to calculate 235 as the midpoint of 203 and 267, what it's doing here is it's taking cell F4 plus G4 divided by 2. And the next one down would be cell F5 plus G5 divided by 2, etc. Next would be our lower boundaries and our upper boundaries. So to determine our lower boundaries, we need to take our lower class limit, which would be 138, and subtract 0.5 from it. And we always subtract 0.5 from our lower class limits to determine the lower boundaries. So since we are always subtracting 0.5, we can leave that, but this part's going to always change based on what our class lower limit is going to be. So instead of 138, we can type in F3 because it's where 138 comes from, and hit enter, and it calculates the lower boundary as being 137.5. And then since this is our formula, we can go to the bottom right corner and get that black plus sign and drag this down and calculate the rest of the lower boundaries. For the upper boundaries, we need to take the upper class limits. So for this class, the upper class limit is 202, and we need to add 0.5 to it. And we're always going to add 0.5 to determine an upper boundary, but the 202 does not remain the same. So instead of 202, we are going to change that to cell G3, since that's where 202 comes from, and hit enter and calculate that upper boundary as 202.5. And then go to the bottom right corner, drag this down, and we have the rest of the upper boundaries determined. To determine our relative frequency, we need to take our frequency, which is 12, coming from cell H3, and divide it by the total number of data values we have in our data set. And we determined that earlier from over here, 26, which is located in cell D5. So if I hit enter and calculate that, we're going to get this value. Now, what you're going to see is something funky is going to happen here when I click and drag this formula down. When I click and drag this formula down, okay, especially right here, you see it's dividing by 0, we get an error. And we should never have a relative frequency that is greater than 1. It should always be 1 or less, between 0 and 1. So what's happening here is you'll see we're taking 12, which we want, divided by the 26, which is H3 and D5. But when we drag a formula down, it changes the cell it selects from. So you'll see cell H4, 6, which we do want, but now it changed, instead of having the 26, which we want to stay the same, it moved it down. So what I can do is I'm going to clear some of this out and go back to what we started with here. This D5, if I want this to not change and always stay 26, you could just simply type in 26, but if I put in a symbol of a $ right between the D and the 5, what that does is it keeps that D5 constant and will never change it when we drag the formula down. So I'll hit enter now. Now if I go to the bottom right corner and drag this down, you'll see we get relative frequencies that look much like they're supposed to. So if I click into each of these, you'll see that each of these still have D $5 that we're dividing by, and what changes each time is the H3, 4, 5, 6, 7 based on the frequencies that we're needing for the classes. And finally, for the cumulative frequencies, we need to use a function that is the sum function. So I'm going to type in equals and then the word sum and then a parenthesis, and what we want to add together here are the frequencies that we've accumulated thus far as we progress through the classes. So I want to start with my first frequency of 12, which is coming from cell H3, and then I'm going to type in a colon here because we want to add in H3 through, and here we just only want through H3. Put a parenthesis around that, and so our cumulative frequency so far is 12. Now you'll notice if I click and drag that our cumulative frequencies aren't growing, but it's actually just the same as our frequencies because it changes H3 and H3 to H4, H4, H5, H5, H6, H6, etc. What we want to have happen is we want the sum, for example here, to be from H3 through H4. And for here, we want it to be from H3 through H5, etc. So we always want this one here, the first one, to be H3. So to keep that H3, we can put a $sign in between H and 3. And then this one, we don't want this to change. So we can leave that one as it is, and I'll hit enter on this first cell right here. So I change the formula in this first cell, and go to the bottom right corner and drag this down, and it's going to recalculate here our cumulative frequencies of 12, 18, 22, 23, and 26.